What's up everyone, it's ENDYMION, and there's been some interesting developments when it comes to certain sectors of the entertainment industry over the past few days. From a senior game designer of Dungeons & Dragons basically blasting the game that birthed franchises like Baldur's Gate into oblivion and then calling it inherently racist, or the founder of Sweet Baby being ousted for saying the true intentions behind their agenda alongside what the entire games industry is moving towards. As well as Alan Wake 2's devs just lying to their audience, and even some Helldivers 2 nonsense as well. Let's start with Baldur's Gate and D&D first with this article from Bounding Into Comics titled, Dungeons & Dragons senior game designer disavows how series was made by white dudes. Boasts that much of original material would never pass our inclusivity reviews today. This article stems from a video that the official Dungeons & Dragons YouTube channel posted about the history of the franchise and where it's going next. It was an interview between Todd Kendrick, who is a content creator for D&D, and he sits opposite Jason Tendro, who is the senior game designer of the entire Dungeons & Dragons franchise. And these two were sitting down to discuss the history of D&D while also, of course, attempting to push a product which they hope people will buy, which encompasses the history of the franchise within it. And near the end of the almost 40-minute discussion, Kendrick decides to pull the conversation towards how D&D was inherently a very racist and white male-dominated franchise for decades, and that they, alongside many others working at Wizards of the Coast, have worked tirelessly to undo the concepts and history of D&D's very white male legacy. It's a very pathetic ending to the interview, because not only does it show that Wizards of the Coast as a whole has their heart in the wrong place, but proves time and again that these companies will genuinely virtue signal themselves into the grave before standing up to the woke mind virus that grips their entire existence. D&D, in case you don't know, was made by two white guys named Gary Gygax and David Arneson in 1974. A whole whopping 2 decades before I was even born, so this franchise is pretty old to begin with. And I genuinely hate how so many franchises are attempting to forsake their legacies simply because white men were involved in making it. Not only do I find that disingenuous, but also extremely pathetic as well, because it doesn't matter how diverse or how many genders your current employees claim to have. They can never change the fact that Dungeons & Dragons, like other franchises such as Star Wars or Marvel Comics, all these franchises were created by white men. And while that's not me trying to play some gotcha or anything, it's simply stating that the facts are the facts and history is what it is. You can sit there and cry about it, saying it's somehow racist that white men came up with so many beloved franchises and ideas, but doesn't change the fact that history is what it is. Of course, in today's current modern era, history doesn't seem to matter at all anymore. And oftentimes it gets malformed and contorted to fit whatever twisted ideals the current guard in charge of these franchises want instead. In D&D, being made by white men in the 70s is somehow a bad thing. Already out of the gate, this interview shilling their book is giving a bad look. And if you even look at the comments on that YouTube video, by the way, you got people saying stuff like this. This is a great play-by-play acknowledgement of how Wizards of the Coast has ruined Dungeons & Dragons. And they're sadly right, because nothing pains me more than to see people sitting there having to apologize for what they look like in order to ensure they're not fired or cancelled over it. There's nothing inherently wrong with the fact that D&D was made by white men, and sadly at one point during that discussion over the legacy of D&D, and the inherent racism of it because white men made it, Jason Tendro says that concepts like the fighter class were updated for modern audiences. Because originally, the class was called Fighting Man, because according to Tendro, the majority of people who played D&D back in the day were men. Specifically, in his own words, they were all white dudes from Lake Geneva and the Twin Cities. This pointless virtue signaling by Tendro is not only stupid, but shameful, as he just in a single sentence diluted the existence of David Arneson and Gary Gygax, who again, may I remind you, created D&D to begin with as being nothing more than ignorant white men whose ideas were just as old as they were apparently. And therefore, because they were old white men, naturally that means their ideas are somehow now problematic and terrible. Where we know if the creators were any other skin color, these same things would never be uttered in any way. If the creators of D&D were instead one black man and a Hispanic man, they would be considered trailblazers, and any idea they came up with would be worshipped like a new religion. But simply because these creators are white, well, we can't be celebrating that now, can we? It's disgusting, and I've always loathed seeing people who didn't make something in the first place thinking they have the right to spit on the graves of those who built the very kingdoms they find themselves living in. We wouldn't have D&D without those men, and they should be celebrated and honored, not belittled, reduced, and erased from the very thing they spent their whole lives creating. I figure we listen to that segment from the video so you can get the full context. It's a little over 3 minutes long, but I think you'll see what I mean, so here's the clip.
And it's important that this is a historical document. So there are things, it was a different time. So we've had an inclusivity review of all these materials.
Multiple. So let's take a step back here. Let's clarify. There are materials in original Dungeons & Dragons that would never pass our inclusivity reviews today. And a lot of it is, some of it you can understand. Like, okay, these are a bunch of war gamers, and they're using armies from history. And so when they create a warrior class for Dungeons & Dragons, they call it the fighting man, right? Because that's what they were used to, and they were all men. They were all white dudes from Lake Geneva and the Twin Cities. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? Like there's a lot of material in this book, and I won't go over all of it, but it would not pass our inclusivity reviews today. Well, we couldn't change it. It's history. What we can do is acknowledge it and show how far we've come, because that's not D&D anymore, right? D&D gets more diverse and has a larger audience every day. The more diverse the game becomes, the more people of different genders and ethnic backgrounds and faiths see themselves in the game. Then they go make their own versions of the game, and more players start to see themselves represented in the game. The more diverse the creators get, the more diverse the players become, and that's the way it should be.
As you can see, Jason even says with a straight face that the majority of what D&D was known for would not pass their inclusivity reviews these days. All that tells me is that what was once considered the Bible of Dungeons & Dragons, which permeated into other franchises like Baldur's Gate, for example, are now no longer deemed worthy and must be changed and contorted to fit the modern audience viewpoint. Everything said during this segment was disrespectful and pathetic, and I can smell the soy in these men's veins just from their words alone. If everything D&D was built upon is nothing but problematic and bad in their eyes, then why even attach yourselves to D&D to begin with? Why not go make your own thing that may be similar but without the D&D moniker attached to it? Well, we all know the answer to that, don't we? Because most of these people aren't talented enough to actually make anything of importance on their own. And instead, they need to piggyback on things that were made by far more successful individuals, like the creators of D&D, because otherwise their ideas and concepts would fall flat and never go anywhere. I would love to see a competitor to D&D that is completely separate and just full of woke identity politics. I genuinely would be excited for that to happen, because then I could sit there and watch in real time as that concept would fail, and everybody would lose their jobs and the entire concept would just fade into obscurity. But this is what these sorts of people do, and I don't need people as in certain skin types either, because clearly the two men here opening their butt cheeks and dropping some gravy on D&D's legacies are obviously white men themselves. And this is what I mean when I say that wokeness is not just a word or something, it's a mind virus. It's a concept that, over time, rewrites the critical thinking pathways of someone's brain until all that's left is someone with NPC-like behaviors, who can't think or act for themselves in fear of retaliation. And I think it's actually great that this particular interview anyway has two white guys being soy milk bitch boys on it as well, because it proves that the mind virus can infect anyone regardless of color or creed. And this is not a fight of white man versus black man or whatever people want to say, it's a battle of the mind. A crusade against the evils of ideology that is killing and mutating everything we love into these mindless, lesser husks we see today. Need I remind you that back in 2023, Hasbro, which owns D&D, laid off 800 people across the company. Then, near the end of 2023, they laid off another 1,100 workers, which severely impacted places like Wizards of the Coast. That's around 20% of Hasbro's entire workforce evaporating and being removed within a year. Yet, they'll have you believe that Wizards of the Coast, and Dungeons & Dragons especially, is going very strong still. Well, if that were the case, you wouldn't be laying off so many people that worked there, would you? Also, during those layoffs, Baldur's Gate 3's director and owner of Larian Studios, Van Vink, even publicly acknowledged the layoffs on Twitter, and was devastated to hear that the majority of the people he worked with when first conceptualizing BG3 have all been laid off from the company. So how can such a successful game tied to D&D do what it does and lead to layoffs? Well, the answer is that simply Larian, of course, is not a part of Hasbro, they're a private company. And while of course I'm sure Hasbro gets a portion of the revenue from BG3, clearly even then it wasn't enough to save the burning empire that is Hasbro in all forms. So how can D&D be failing as much as it is and laying off so many people? Why aren't people supporting D&D as much? What's the issue? It's simple, of course, because they've been infiltrated by the mind virus. And time and again, whether it's race-swapping Aragorn and their Lord of the Rings card sets or these stupid inclusivity reviews which are dictated and conducted by people with jobs that shouldn't exist in the first place, it's clear that all of the pandering, erasure of legacy, and changes to the core design documents of what makes D&D is doing nothing but pushing people away. D&D, like so many other legacy franchises, have effectively alienated their own audiences in the same way as they always do. Reject the people who made you what you are and be stupid enough to believe that there is another imaginary audience out there who will support you instead that fits your agenda and politics. The easiest term to quantify what they want is that they're chasing the modern audience, which time and again doesn't exist anyway. So what you end up with is a product made for neither the people willing to support you or the people that aren't interested or even exist to begin with. Ultimately, you're making nothing for nobody, and Hasbro, as many other companies before them, are refusing to admit that this new way of thinking, this ESG soy-infused DEI nonsense, doesn't work whatsoever. But of course, the problem isn't that they're spending millions on paying diversity hires to check their work to make sure it's not racist or whatever. The problem is that D&D just isn't inclusive enough, and it needs to become even more inclusive, diverse, and woke, and surely that'll fix everything. Great idea, Hasbro and Wizards. Just keep digging your grave wider and deeper. That'll get you out of it for sure. Or maybe build a ladder to get out of that mass grave you've built and start actually going back to giving people what they want. Because clearly what you're doing has done nothing but cause almost 2,000 people to lose their jobs instead. And how Tondro said it during the interview here solidifies everything that's wrong. We couldn't change it, it's history. What we can do is acknowledge it and show how far we've come, because that's not D&D anymore. That's not D&D anymore. Man, it's the same tired concept over and over again, isn't it? The first step is this franchise is for everyone, so a bunch of people come in to enjoy the hobby. Then certain groups that are let in due to gatekeeping being abolished suddenly start demanding changes to the franchise they've recently entered into. Then those groups quickly, through threats and strong-arming, gain a foothold within that franchise and announce we need to make this franchise more inclusive, and they end up taking control. Then the creators of the franchise are eventually abolished and the history of the franchise is rejected and altered to fit a new agenda. You could argue, was I even talking about D&D there? Or was it Star Wars, Marvel, DC, a certain video game franchise? Yeah, you could take what I just said and it sadly perfectly layers on top of pretty much every single bad decision made to any beloved franchise of the past 50 years and then some. The problem isn't gatekeeping, fellas. The problem is that there isn't enough gatekeeping. If you enter a franchise or fandom and instead of respecting said fandom's rules and community, you decide that the franchise has to now adhere to your rules, congratulations, you just ruined a good thing because you're an insufferable dumbass. And ultimately, the only people you can really blame are the higher-ups who allow these sorts of things to happen. They hire one woke weirdo who manages to get into a position where they can hire others, be it through strong-arming or threats, and then that weirdo hires 5 other weirdos who think like them. And then suddenly, you got entire departments of weirdos, and before you know it, all your bases belong to the lunatics, and the patients are now running the asylum instead. I mean, there was even this clip recently where Kim Belair, the co-founder of Sweet Baby Inc., just said the quiet part out loud. Here, listen.
We work very hard to get marginalized talent into the industry, to protect them the way that we would want to have been protected, to lift them up, and to get them into an industry where they're too often shut out. And basically, I think to take over in the hopes that some really dope people will be able to lead into kind of a new era for an industry that's been kind of, the same way too long.
And as you can see from the mouth of the brood mother herself, Kim Belair says it as plain as day. It's not about equity and diversity, it's about conquering through fear and racism to enact their preferred ideologies. It's never been about making any of these products or franchises better. Because these people, like Kim Belair or this Kendrick guy over at D&D, know that they could never make something as layered, interesting, or as popular as D&D on their own. This is why, time and again, these franchises are hijacked by activists and then their friends infiltrate alongside them via being hired for having similar skin colors, genders, or ideas, and then voila. All of the things you loved are ruined and massacred beyond recognition. And if things keep going the way that they are, eventually there will come a time where these activists will silently but surely remove the names of the D&D creators. And suddenly, the white dudes, as they like to call them, will have their names and legacies pushed out by the very thing they created. And now the new age of woke inclusivity will just take over. The same thing is happening over with Helldivers 2. Those same kinds of groups are all pushing and attacking the devs to strong-arm them into allowing for representation. They don't want representation for the sake of it, they want it so they can establish and slowly but surely take over that hobby or game and then claim it for themselves. And having articles like the one from Polygon where they blasted the Helldivers community is only made to scare the developers into submission. It's the same tactics as always, and it's so tiring. It's either you fall in line and play by our rules, or we will write hit pieces on you over and over again, until you eventually crack under the pressure and kiss our feet like the good pets you are. And I find that disingenuous, disgusting, and very messed up to say the least. In that Polygon article, by the way, they interview players who are actively within the Helldivers community. Of course, the only people they actually interviewed were people who came from certain communities like LGBT ones. Because, obviously, Polygon wanted to paint a narrative that strengthened their points and proved their article right. So naturally, everyone interviewed either identified as trans or whatever else, and they said stuff like, and I quote via Polygon, "Players have found other ways to combat the hate. The Super Earth Says Trans Right Discord server, a queer-led group of 70 current members, is one of the several sub-communities that sprawled outward from the official Helldivers 2 server. The channel Bigot Watching collects hundreds of messages and interactions where users in official Helldivers 2 channels, such as the Helldivers official Discord, had insulted members of the Discord using slurs and threatened them via DMs. In screenshots shared with Polygon, these users had explicitly used Nazi speech to primarily target trans and furry folks, as well as using images of related paraphernalia such as SS uniforms in their profile pictures. Developer Arrowhead did not respond to Polygon's request for comment about any of these issues in time for publication. The problem here isn't actually the bigots, those are an unfortunate fact of life that can never be fully eradicated, user Bapanada said over Discord. The problem is that Arrowhead's official spaces have made the deliberate decision to silence LGBTQ+ voices under the guise of banning any political discussion. As if people's identities are political, and as if this game was not created and marketed as a heavy-handed piece of political satire, end quote. Of course, I'm aware that every community will have bigoted people in it. Like those quotes said, it's impossible to rid the world of any ideology fully. But I do find it interesting that one of those groups they spoke to had an entire sub-channel in their Discord that was designed to collect anything they deemed problematic within. And ultimately, I think the reason for that is simple, so these messages, or whatever, can be used as ammunition in order to strong-arm developer Arrowhead into bending the knee and giving these groups what they want. And what I attest these Helldivers debacles when comparing it to the Baldur's Gate D&D historical nonsense discussion is that it's not just enough for, let's say, a trans or gay group within a game's community to exist. They have to exert their influence and existence onto others to force them into acknowledging them. Or in D&D's case, these ideologies must become the guiding light above all else. And if that's not allowed, then these companies get strong-armed into acting the way these groups want. So while again I don't condone bigotry per se, I will play devil's advocate here for a second and ask an uncomfortable question that others will likely do because they will shy away from such talk. Could those players just be racist and that's it? Or are they like that because they've seen what happens when you don't gatekeep enough? I do think there is definitely a layer of bigotry to the debate, of course it is. But like always, I do try to see it from all sides and say the uncomfortable parts out loud because I think it'll lead to a more interesting conversation. If D&D's creators and such were more vigilant when it came to gatekeeping, could that have prevented the sorry state of their franchise that it is today? And I don't mean by banning gay or trans people, but simply by keeping the franchise as non-political as possible. And I know some will say, well, being gay or whatever isn't inherently political, which sure you could say that to an extent. But the reality is that groups like these have made it their mission in many parts to push their influence into politics, schools, entertainment, and so on. So while maybe before these concepts weren't political, they have definitely become politicized themselves over time. It's a touchy subject, I know, and there's not a clear answer for many. But I do think the best thing most of these companies could do is adhere to what Arrowhead Studios is doing with Helldivers. Just reject all the politics and keep it neutral. Bring people together through gameplay and leave all the nonsense behind, but like always, it's never enough. And that's what we're seeing. Helldivers 2 is the latest game being majorly attacked and pressured by journalists and communities to abide by their rules. Because if they could do it in D&D, Star Wars, Marvel, and more, why not also Helldivers? But of course, they'll gaslight you and say, well, we're not trying to exert our influence, which we know is a lie for sure. Recently, there were some debates surrounding Alan Wake 2 and Sweet Baby and how these consulting groups do not, in their words, affect or change the games they work on. That's what they say apparently. Well, the developer of Alan Wake 2 had this to say regarding how Saga Anderson, the main character of that game, was not race swapped due to the consultant's strong arming. He said, "It's absolutely not true." Well, okay then, should be one and done, right? Well, not exactly. There was an article from GameDeveloper.com in November 2023 where Remedy was interviewed about Saga Anderson and Alan Wake 2. Here's what was said in terms of how Remedy came to creating Saga. And before I read that, here's a picture of the original Saga Anderson actress as seen in Quantum Break. A white woman with blonde hair and blue eyes. Okay, now that you've seen the original Saga and how she looks now, let's see how it all came to be, shall we? GameDeveloper.com said, and I quote, "For creating Saga Anderson, the developers at Remedy took a different approach compared to the process behind other hero characters, resulting in a more organic creative collaboration across different disciplines at Remedy Entertainment and outside parties. Along with working with story and narrative consultants Kim Belair of Sweet Baby Inc. to refine the character voice and story arc. The key creatives of Alan Wake 2 also worked extensively with the actress playing Saga Anderson, Melanie Libbard, who offered suggestions and other insights that led to the Saga Anderson scene in the final game. I think that it took us a long time to find Saga," said Kyle Rowley, director of Alan Wake 2 on the character. "It was an interesting process. We had an idea in our head of what the character could be. But then, as the character evolves over time, being open to changing her based on input from the actors and from external sources really opened things up for us. I think that's important for us as a studio to be okay with because we don't do it very often for our characters. This idea of how to create a new hero character, so it is kind of a big moment for us. And it was definitely interesting for me going through that process," end quote. So, Kyle Rowley lied through his teeth and they openly admit that yet again, Sweet Baby clearly strong-armed them into turning Saga from white to a black woman. The reason why I'm showing you this, and here I'll even put the page on screen here, which was neatly provided via Twitter user DakaDaka's account as shown here, you can see as plain as day that the influence of an activist like Belair led to Remedy changing Saga because she strong-armed them into doing so. And if they didn't, she would likely blast them to other colleagues in studios like she said previously in the past if she doesn't get her way. What I've shown you today is proof enough that there is a constant push by groups to force everything to bend to their every whims. Whether it's Dungeons & Dragons, Helldivers, or even soy milk games like Alan Wake 2, which I unfortunately beat myself and hated it, a lot of these games are disingenuous. And D&D and Alan prove that there are activists at play working to take over the gaming industry in order to transform it into a shadow of its former self. And Helldivers' controversy proves that if you don't play ball and submit, your reputation is attacked and your credibility is questioned in articles and blasting almost constantly. If you still don't believe there's an agenda at hand, then you're either blind or willfully ignorant to its existence. Video games are being ruined before our eyes, and we need to keep them accountable with our wallets and keep ourselves as informed as humanly possible. Otherwise, you'll end up like D&D, a corpse of its former glory with diminishing returns, while also willingly ignoring the creators who made it in the first place all because of their sex and skin color. There is a rot in this industry, my friends, and I intend to flush it all out. As always, thank you for watching, subscribe, like, and share the video, and have a great day. Thanks to my patrons as always, and I hope you enjoy some non-soy-filled video games on this fine day. I'll see you in the next one.